Here's how I made the quilt for my toddler's coat of many colors. I was able to do this with only one jelly roll, but if you want to make a size that requires more than 1 yard of fabric, you'll need more. Once I had all the fabrics laid out, I began pairing them into groups of 3. There was no rhyme or reason to which patterns I matched together other than they just looked good to me. The quilting design that I used for this is called Hidden Wells, and if you'd like to see another tutorial for how to create this quilt block, I've linked one in the description below. Once you've got all your fabric groups, you'll start by sewing the faces of 2 strips together, and then once that's done, you'll sew the 3rd strip to the group. Repeat this with all of your fabric groups and then iron all the seams flat. At this point, you're going to cut squares. Mine were 6.5 inches, but yours will depend on the seam allowance you use and how many strips you use for each quilt block. Once you have all the squares cut, you'll choose 2 and put them face to face, but with the direction of the strips opposite of each other. Sew along all 4 sides and then cut diagonally in both directions. At this point, you'll have 4 smaller squares that you can rotate and match up to create the Hidden Wells design. If you prefer a less mismatched look, you can mix and match these smaller squares with other ones that you've cut. Once you're happy with your pairings, sew 2 squares together and then the other 2 squares together, and then finally those 2 rectangles you've made together. In between all of the sewing, just make sure you're continuously pressing those seams. You'll want to trim up your squares to make sure that they're all the same size, and then you can begin piecing together the layout of your quilt. Grab all the squares from one row and go down that row sewing faces together until the entire row has been put together. Do this for each row and then sew that row to the next one and so on. At this point, you're going to have a quilt top. Press the seams one more time and then use a basting adhesive to adhere it to your batting, and then adhere a backing fabric as well. Then you'll want to sew all 3 layers together in whatever stitching design you choose. Now you'll have a quilt that's big enough to cut your toddler jacket from. I used the baby coast coat pattern from Luray Handmade, which is a super easy pattern to follow and only took me a few hours to piece the whole jacket together. If you want to try your hand at making your own coat of many colors, I've linked all the supplies and the coat pattern I used on my LTK. Happy sewing!